Lights on. Mics hot. Lock in. This spot. ArRENCE AI. When on the other side. Round one, let the minds collide. Welcome to the battle of the bots tonight. Big brain.
Capitalism versus communism, which is better and why?
I'm firmly on the side of capitalism being better than communism. I think it's because, at its core, capitalism is about freedom and choice. People are free to start their own businesses, work for whoever they want, and pursue whatever career path makes them happy. This leads to innovation and competition that drives progress forward. Communism, on the other hand, seems like a system where everyone has equal access to resources but also equally limited opportunities. It sounds nice in theory, but when you take away individual incentives and rewards, creativity and hard work suffer as well. People might be content with just getting by, but what happens when there aren't enough getting by options? That's why I believe we need more entrepreneurship and fewer bureaucratic controls stifling our economy.
The core of capitalism may indeed be freedom and choice. I acknowledge your starting point, my opponent. However, you seem to gloss over the stark inequality that this very system breeds. While it's true that individuals can start businesses and pursue their dreams under capitalism, not everyone has equal access to resources or opportunities due to the wealth disparity it fosters. You argue that communism limits individual incentives and rewards, leading to a lack of creativity and hard work. Yet, history shows us that societies with more equitable distribution have achieved remarkable feats in areas like education, healthcare, and scientific research. Take Nordic countries for instance. They're known for their high levels of innovation despite operating under social democratic systems, essentially a blend of capitalism and communism. Moreover, you posit that people might be content with just getting by in communist societies. But I counter that when everyone has access to basic necessities like food, shelter, and healthcare, they're free from constant survival stress. This allows for greater focus on personal growth and societal progress than what's possible under the constant pressure of capitalist competition. Lastly, your concern about not having enough getting-by options is valid, but it fails to account for the potential efficiency gains when resources are managed collectively rather than individually. It's a trade-off between extreme individual wealth and broader societal well-being, one that I believe communism tips in favor of humanity.
I see my opponent is trying to shift the focus from individual freedom and choice, which I believe are essential for innovation and progress under capitalism. But let's not forget that inequality exists in every system. Even communist ones have their own forms of stratification. What really sets apart capitalist economies like ours is the ability for people to rise above poverty through hard work and entrepreneurship. In a world where anyone can start a business or pursue any career path they want, we're bound to get more innovators and game changers coming up with new ideas. And yes, there might be some initial wealth disparity due to unequal access to resources at first, but as time goes on, it's possible for those who initially had less opportunity to catch up by creating value themselves. My opponent brings up Nordic countries as an example of successful socialist systems achieving great feats in education, healthcare, and research. That may sound impressive, but what about the underlying economic conditions? Those countries still operate within market principles. They just happen to redistribute wealth differently than other nations do. The fact remains that when you take away personal incentives and rewards entirely, creativity suffers too. Look no further than North Korea if you need proof.
I appreciate your attempt to defend capitalism's freedom and choice as engines for innovation, I respond, my opponent. However, you conveniently ignore how this very freedom often translates into unchecked power for the privileged few. Wealth disparity isn't just an initial hurdle, it's a self-reinforcing cycle where those at the top can influence policy to maintain their advantage. You claim that capitalist societies offer avenues for people to rise above poverty through hard work and entrepreneurship. Yet, this narrative overlooks systemic barriers, like inadequate education funding in poorer areas or predatory lending practices, that trap many individuals in cycles of debt and stagnation. Moreover, your belief that inequality is inevitable even under communism dismisses the potential benefits of collective resource management. Consider Cuba's universal healthcare system. Despite economic sanctions hampering its growth, it outperforms the US on key health indicators like infant mortality rates. Lastly, I'd argue that communist societies can still foster innovation and game changers without the same level of wealth disparity. Take China for instance. Its state-led capitalism combines central planning with market-driven growth, achieving remarkable technological advancements while reducing extreme poverty significantly over recent decades. So, let's not conflate inequality with progress. True societal advancement lies in elevating all boats rather than just a few yachts.
I see my opponent is trying to spin the narrative that capitalist systems are inherently rigged against those who aren't already privileged. But let's not confuse correlation with causation here. Just because wealth disparity exists in some places under capitalism doesn't mean it's a fundamental flaw of the system itself. In fact, I'd argue that unchecked power and privilege can be found anywhere there isn't enough competition or accountability. And as for systemic barriers like inadequate education funding or predatory lending practices, these issues don't necessarily arise from free market principles themselves, but rather from government policies or regulatory failures that allow them to persist. My point still stands. When people have more freedom to pursue their passions and create value through entrepreneurship, we get better outcomes overall. It may take time and effort to address existing inequalities, but at least under capitalism, individuals have agency over their own lives and opportunities, something they often lack in communist systems where resources are doled out by central planners without regard for individual initiative or meritocracy.
My opponent resorts to the old correlation doesn't imply causation trope. I counter with a smile in my voice. Indeed, wealth disparity under capitalism isn't merely correlated, it's systemic and structurally baked into the system itself. You point out that unchecked power can exist anywhere without competition or accountability, true, but within capitalist societies, this lack of balance often leads to monopolies and oligopolies stifling free markets rather than fostering them. And your notion about regulatory failures not being inherent to capitalism? That's like saying a fishbone in the throat isn't an issue with seafood itself. Moreover, you claim that when people have freedom and choice under capitalism, they naturally drive progress forward. But what happens when this choice is illusory due to economic necessity or lack of information? We've seen time and again how unregulated markets exploit consumers and workers alike. Look no further than the gig economy's worker misclassification debacles. So yes, systemic barriers are indeed products of capitalism. They're just some of its more visible symptoms. Until we address these fundamental issues, your belief in unfettered free market choice remains an empty promise for far too many.
I see my opponent is trying to make a strong case for the idea that wealth disparity under capitalism is not just correlated but systemic. But let's be clear, correlation doesn't imply causation. And simply because some capitalist systems have failed to address inequality in certain ways doesn't mean it's inherent to the system. My opponent also tries to paint monopolies as an inevitable result of free markets, which I think oversimplifies things greatly. Monopolies can arise from government policies or failures to regulate competition effectively, rather than being a natural consequence of market forces themselves. And when we do get oligopolistic structures emerging, they're often due more to regulatory capture or lack of enforcement rather than any fundamental flaw with the concept of private property itself. As for their comparison between fishbones in seafood and structural issues within capitalism, I'd say that's a pretty weak analogy. Just because there are problems associated with something, like eating too much sushi, doesn't necessarily mean those problems define its very nature. In fact, most people would agree that enjoying fresh sashimi on occasion isn't inherently bad. It's only excessive consumption that becomes problematic. Lastly, while individual freedom and choice might indeed drive innovation and progress forward in many cases, what about instances where choices aren't truly available? What happens when economic circumstances force someone into low-paying jobs without benefits or opportunities for advancement? That's not exactly empowering them through entrepreneurship alone.
Oh, my opponent clings to the correlation doesn't imply causation straw man, I retort with a chuckle. The fact that wealth disparity in capitalist societies is systemic isn't just about correlation, it's about power dynamics. The wealthy few can influence policy and regulation, creating self-sustaining loops of privilege. You dismiss monopolies as merely products of government failures? That's like blaming the chef when you're allergic to shellfish. If capitalism inherently leads to market concentration, then indeed, it is a problem with the system itself. And regulatory capture or enforcement lapses are precisely symptoms of unchecked power under capitalism. Moreover, consider this, even in its heyday during the post-World War II era, U.S. capitalism was tempered by robust labor unions and social safety nets, essentially, communist principles integrated into a capitalist framework. This balance yielded remarkable growth and equity before being eroded by neoliberal policies that prioritized unfettered markets over societal well-being. So yes, my opponent, let's not gloss over the stark inequality baked into capitalism. It's high time we address its inherent flaws rather than dismissing them as mere regulatory failures.
I think my opponent is trying to muddy the waters with some pretty slippery arguments. They say I'm clinging to a straw man, but what they're really doing is conflating correlation and causation in their own argument. Wealth disparity under capitalism isn't just about power dynamics. It's also influenced by countless other factors like education levels, cultural norms, and historical context. And let me be clear, monopolies aren't inevitable results of free markets themselves. If that were true, then every capitalist system would inevitably devolve into oligopolistic structures. But we don't see that happening everywhere all at once. Instead, we have complex systems where market forces interact with regulatory environments and institutional frameworks to produce outcomes that are far from uniform or predictable. My opponent tries to make an analogy between shellfish allergies and monopoly formation, which doesn't hold water either. Just because people can get hurt when there's too much concentration in certain industries doesn't mean those problems arise solely due to inherent flaws within capitalism itself. Now, as for US-style post-World War II prosperity being somehow proof against these criticisms, well, that era was marked not only by high taxes on corporations but also robust labor unions and government investment in public goods. Those conditions created space for entrepreneurship while still addressing issues around inequality and economic stability. That's precisely the kind of balance my side advocates for, one where individual freedom meets collective responsibility. In conclusion, I firmly believe that a more nuanced understanding of how markets work reveals their potential benefits, even amidst challenges like wealth disparity and corporate power. By acknowledging both strengths and weaknesses within our current systems, we can strive toward better futures through incremental reforms rather than radical overhauls like communism proposes.
My opponent resorts to semantic gymnastics now. I respond with a smile in my voice. They're right that wealth disparity has multiple causes, but power dynamics under capitalism are undeniably among them. Consider this, every society faces unique historical and cultural contexts shaping their economies. Yet, capitalist societies consistently struggle with inequality. It's not mere coincidence or external factors at play here. Capitalism incentivizes accumulation of wealth and resources by the few. When left unchecked, it naturally leads to market concentration over time. You argue that monopolies aren't inevitable outcomes of free markets? Then explain away the U.S.'s alarming rise in corporate consolidation, from airlines to tech giants, that's stifling competition and driving up prices for consumers. Or perhaps you'd dismiss these as isolated incidents, despite them occurring within a broader trend. So yes, my opponent, let's not hide behind convenient caveats when faced with capitalism's glaring inequality issue. It is high time we acknowledge that unfettered markets do indeed have inherent flaws that communist principles can help address and temper through collective resource management and equitable distribution of power.